So then, little quick tips for making a podcast. Stuff to remember. I say good podcast, but like on everything, the content is the king here as well. So, but basically, when you're doing audio, one thing that is missing on this list is try to make the audio as good as you can, because it's nicer to listen to good audio that is not echoing or there are not a lot of like background noises behind it. It's so much easier to listen to. But nevertheless, what you are speaking is the important part. But one thing that I shared here was that make some kind of a production schedule and try to stick to it. And by this I'm meaning if you are doing a weekly podcast or monthly podcast, do it weekly or do it monthly. Because when people are actually tuning in and trying and starting to listen to your podcast, they are actually expecting to have a new podcast every week if you say that's a weekly podcast. And if they are not getting that, they lose the interest on that podcast. They could lose. Sometimes no, but they could lose the interest of that podcast. So try to keep the face and like I said, if you're doing corporate or a corporate podcast, you could have these themes already thinked up. And if you are different kind of a panelist, you could think up that and then just say that you'll be here at that time. And, you can actually record like 50 episodes per 1 week. And then just say this is a weekly podcast and you just publish them weekly. Or do 3 or 4 straight and then try to just put them at the week after week. Try to keep the episode on the subject. If I'm talking about Puhujankulma, sometimes we lose the golden line. But if you have the topic inside your or description of that one episode, the people are actually maybe they found that episode to be interesting because of that subject. And if you're rambling about something else and you have like an 35-minute podcast and you only talked about 5 minutes of that topic and 30 minutes of something else, well, maybe next time they are not going to listen to that podcast. So try to keep the episode on that one subject. Of course, you can always, like we do after we have recorded the podcast, then we actually made the name of the episode and make some kind of list where you can actually read what we talked about on that. So that way we make sure that those were the topics and we actually talked about it. I put here try to have a script, but don't have like a word-to-word kind of script, but some kind of a list that you can just go through. When you know that you went through all those topics on that list, you gathered all the information that we promised, or we talked about everything that we wanted to talk about. It always helps. And I was looking at what is the best length for podcast. Of course, it always depends on what you are actually doing. If you have like a 4 panelist and you have good conversation coming through, don't cut it. Just to have it in a 10 minutes mark, if that's a good conversation. But there's some indication that the length for podcast is 10 to 30 minutes. Basically, you have to think about when people are actually going to listen to your episode. Are they driving from home to work, or are they going to listen to this while they are doing some cleaning? I don't know. And then, if you are thinking if you have very long like we have in Puhujankulma, like 3 hours. Believe me or not, people are actually listening to those. But nevertheless, if you have only like an 30 minutes drive to your home, you still have like an 2.5 an hour podcast, and you have to put pause, and maybe you listen the next part on the next day. But did you actually remember what we have to say in the first part? So sometimes when you're starting, it's easy to have this shorter episode as well. Just get the ideas that you wanted to talk about, that those ideas and texts were actually talked about on that podcast. That's like the necessary part. Why I put there, but this is not a radio. On radio, you only have like a 10 or 30 minute slots, or in TV, and that's not 30 minutes. It's I think 25 if you have commercials, and then you are very limited to have like an every time 10 minutes, and that's all. But you're not on a radio. This is a podcast. You can vary. The one episode can be 10 minutes. The second one could be 15. And there could be something between, like a 13 minutes episodes if you want. And one thing is try to engage the listeners. Sometimes it's hard, and one thing to make attention here is to remember that they are not listening to your podcast live, and they could be listening to that podcast a month after you have actually done it. So if you're talking about something that happened right now, maybe that's too late to people. But then again, if like Puhujankulma, we are talking about the tech news of the week, of course we are talking about things that can be happening on the next week, and gave some pointers to look into next week, because that's the idea behind it. But remember that podcast is something that you can actually start listening to. Some persons that say that they have started listening to Puhujankulma like let's say 2 years ago, and we have done it this 8 years. And some people are also, of course, they started listening to the latest episodes, but they started from the day one. I don't know why. We are using speaking about tech news, but then again, try to engage the listeners. It's always good to make notice that there's somebody actually listening to it, and that's always nice when you're actually listening to it. And if there's something that people can send questions or comments, then try to implement those into podcast if that is doable.